Great. I can see that people are starting to call in. Welcome, everybody, to Silicon Valley at Home's Affordable Housing Month, featuring Richard Rothstein, who's the author of Color of Law. Really appreciate you joining us today. I'm Leslie Corsilia. I'm Executive Director of Silicon Valley at Home. And we're really excited to have you here during Affordable Housing Month, which happens every May in Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley at Home was created to establish a dedicated voice for affordable housing in the South Bay and is committed to shaping policies and public awareness to advance housing affordability through research, advocacy, and education. This Affordable Housing Month, we have over 50 events and activities that highlight the important work of SV at Home and all of our community partners on issues relating to affordable housing all across the county. This year's theme is Silicon Valley at Home, or excuse me, is home, and is dedicated to our community. Whether our families have lived here for generations, or just settling in, Silicon Valley is where we live and where we want our neighbors to have access to a safe, stable, and affordable home. There's no better time to solidify your houser status and support this critical work than today by becoming a member of SV at Home and a supporter. And we do have information there. There is, here we go, the screen for you to be able to do that. The link can also be found in the chat. We also want to highlight our wonderful sponsors who make Affordable Housing Month possible. We couldn't do it without you. And here is our list, including our title sponsors, Google, Microsoft, and LinkedIn, and many other important sponsors. Again, we couldn't do it without you. Before we begin, we want to highlight several elected officials and their representatives who are joining us today, and we may miss a few. So if you could just in the chat, let us know that you're here if I don't call your name. We have David Fernandez from the Office of Supervisor Susan Ellenberg, Zach Ross from the Office of Assemblymember Mark Berman, Cupertino Councilmember Hung Wei, Gilroy Councilmember Rebecca Armirandas, Gilroy Councilmember Zach Hilton, Los Altos Mayor Nessa Filgore, Los Gatos Mayor Mariko Sayak, Mountain View Vice Mayor Lucas Ramirez, Mountain View Councilmember Pat Showalter, and City of Santa Clara Councilmember Kathy Watanabe. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Katie Farrick, who is Senior Director of Workplace Programs at LinkedIn, today's event sponsor. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you, Silicon Valley at Home, for convening these really important events during Affordable Housing Month, as well as all year long. I encourage everyone to be a member. You learn so much, and that's actually what I'm here today to just thank you for this conversation. And we're grateful at LinkedIn and at Microsoft, I'm sure Jonathan Noble's on the call, to be able to support, in particular, this event. For me personally, this book and learning much more than I ever was even vaguely aware of about the history of racist policies at every level of government was definitely the most impactful read for me for many years. So I'm very grateful that you were able to organize this, and grateful to Richard Rothstein as well as Carlos Rosario for being here today for this conversation. So I look forward to learning a lot more and hopefully finding out some ways we can help address this. So thank you, and back to you, Leslie.
Thank you. I think, let me see the next, please, here. I think next we want Carlos to join us. And Carlos was born and raised in Santa Clara County. He's currently an attorney at Google's sister company, Wing. He has worked in the Santa Clara County Superior Court and the U.S. District Court during the 2008 housing crisis, in addition to being the current president of the Santa Clara County Black Lawyers Association. He also serves on the Santa Clara County La Raza Lawyers Association's Policy Committee, the Santa Clara County Bar Association's Board of Trustees, and the chair of the Bay Area Community Health And one more, he's also on the Santa Clara County Health Advisory Commission. So he has his fingers in a lot of different things, and we're delighted to have him here today to facilitate the conversation. So I'm just going to hand it straight over to Carlos, and we'll get going.
Thank you, Leslie. I think the more things you're involved in, the more you realize they're all intertwined, especially down in the Silicon Valley. So today we're going to be speaking with Richard Rothstein. We'll have about a 40-minute presentation followed by 20 to 30 minutes of question and answers. So to give a little background, Richard Rothstein is the author of The Color of Law, Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. Richard is a distinguished fellow of the Economic Policy Institute, the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and the Haas Institute at the University of California, Berkeley. In addition to his recent book, The Color of Law, he is an author of many other articles and books on race and education, which can be found on his website and his webpage at the Economic Policy Institute. With that, I'll hand it over to Mr. Rothstein and pick it up for questions later on.
Thank you very much, Carlos, and thanks to all of you for engaging with me in this conversation today. Let me begin by reminding all of us that in the 20th century, we had a civil rights movement in this country. It began by challenging segregation in colleges and universities, law schools, graduate schools, and then in 1954 persuaded the Supreme Court to prohibit ongoing segregation, legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools in the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And that Brown decision gave impetus, stimulus, inspiration to a movement of civil rights activists who engaged in marches, in demonstrations, in civil disobedience. Some people lost their lives in that struggle, others were injured, took great courage and perseverance. But by the end of the 1960s, over the course of the next 15 years, that civil rights movement pretty much persuaded much of the country, not everybody, but much of the country, that racial segregation was wrong, that it was immoral, that it was harmful both to African Americans and to whites, that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a constitutional democracy. With that understanding, it succeeded in abolishing segregation in public accommodations, in interstate transportation and local transportation, in employment to a great extent. And then in 1968, in the wake of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it succeeded in getting a fair housing law passed that prohibited ongoing discrimination in the sale and rental of housing. And then once that fair housing law was passed, the civil rights movement pretty much ended. Left untouched, the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them. Many of them that I've lived in had clearly defined areas that were all white or mostly white, clearly defined areas that were all black or mostly black. How could it be if we came to an understanding that racial segregation was wrong, immoral, harmful to both blacks and whites, incompatible with our self-conception as a democratic society? How could it be that we left untouched the biggest segregation of all? Well, I think partly it's because desegregating neighborhoods is hard. If we succeeded in getting an ordinance passed prohibiting the segregation of restaurants, the next day restaurants would be desegregated. Anybody can go to a restaurant, sit where they want in it. If we pass an ordinance, though, prohibiting segregation of neighborhoods, the next day things wouldn't look much different. So what we've done, all of us, and I mean all of us, blacks, whites, liberals, conservatives, northerners, southerners, Democrats, Republicans, all of us adopted a national rationalization, a myth that we tell ourselves, a rationalization, an excuse that prevents us from confronting the fact that we're an apartheid society, confronting the biggest segregation of all. And that rationalization goes something like this. We tell ourselves that the forms of segregation that we abolished in the 20th century whether of law schools or universities or elementary and secondary schools or restaurants or buses. That was all created by government. If the federal government was, for example, requiring segregation on trains that crossed the Mason-Dixon line, that was a civil rights violation, a violation of the Fifth Amendment, something that we have an obligation as Americans under our Constitution to remedy. If state and local governments were doing it, requiring segregation and public accommodations, that was a 14th Amendment violation, a violation of the Constitution, a civil rights violation, something that we as Americans have an obligation to remedy. But residential segregation, we tell ourselves that's something entirely different. That wasn't done by government, by law, by regulation, by public policy. That was just happened naturally. It was an accident. It happened because, private homeowners refused to sell to African Americans in white neighborhoods, or landlords refused to rent to them in white neighborhoods. Or maybe it's because of businesses in the private economy, banks, realtors, insurance companies, developers, discriminated in how they carried out their purely private sector activities. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's just because people like to live with each other of the same race. We feel more comfortable that way, and so we choose to live in same race neighborhoods. Or maybe we tell ourselves it's just an economic situation. Many African Americans can't afford to move to higher opportunity neighborhoods, and that's why we have segregation. All of these individual, bigoted, private sector decisions, self-choices, economic differences is what's created residential segregation. We tell ourselves that what happened by accident can only unhappen by accident. What happened naturally can only unhappen naturally. We think it's too bad, most of us, that we have such a segregated society, as they say, such an apartheid society, but we don't feel an obligation as citizens to do something about it. We give a name to this rationalization. We say what we have is de facto segregation, something that just happened in fact, not in law or regulation. Well, I spent much of my time before working on this book, speaking about today, The Color of Law, writing about education policy. I really knew not much about housing, still don't actually. But as an education policy writer, I came to understand that the education policy that we were following as a nation in the 1990s and 2000s made no sense whatsoever. That policy was that recognizing that we have an achievement gap between Black and white children. African American children achieve at lower levels on average than white children do. Not everyone, but on average. And we attributed the achievement gap to teachers having low expectations of Black children, just not trying very hard. And we came up with this idea that if we could force teachers to try harder, the achievement gap would disappear. This was so widely shared a view that we enacted it into federal law in 2001. It was called the No Child Left Behind Act. That act required that children be tested every year in math and reading, that a light be shown on these test scores, teachers and schools be held accountable for them. And the law predicted that if we did this, if we held teachers accountable, the achievement gap would disappear within just 7 years. It was a ludicrous theory. It didn't work, of course. We have an achievement gap still today that's just about the same size as it was in 2001 when the law was adopted. The only thing the law really accomplished was it gave schools an incentive, if they were teaching Black children and Hispanic children, to abandon a well-rounded curriculum and instead spend much of their time drilling children in test-taking skills. The reason I thought the law was so ridiculous was because although there are some teachers who have low expectations and don't try very hard, that's true in any profession. That's not the reason we have an achievement gap. The reason we have an achievement gap between Black and white children, in particular, a somewhat lesser gap between Hispanic and white children, is because so many of those children come to school with social and economic challenges that inhibit their ability to learn. So, for example, I remember writing one column about asthma. As you may know, African American children in urban neighborhoods typically have asthma at a much higher rate than middle-class children in suburban neighborhoods. In some places, it's 4 times the rate. They have asthma because they live in more polluted neighborhoods, more trucks driving by their homes, more dilapidated buildings, more vermin in the environment, more dust. And if a child has asthma, that child is more likely than a child who doesn't. It's not true in every case, just more likely to be up at night wheezing and then coming to school drowsy the next day. And if you have 2 groups of children who are identical in every respect, same racial composition of each group, same social and economic background, same family structure, but one group is different only in this one respect, that it has a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group's going to have lower average achievement by a small amount. Asthma isn't a big contributor to the achievement gap, but then you begin to think of all of the other social and economic conditions that inhibit children's ability to learn, that are predominant in African American children. Lead poisoning, much more prevalent among African Americans than whites, because African American children are more likely to live in homes where water is still being delivered by lead pipes, more likely to live in homes where paint is peeling off and lead-based paint and polluting their lungs and their bodies. Lead poisoning has a measurable effect on IQ. Homelessness, economic insecurity, many, many other such challenges. If you add them all up, you've pretty much explained the achievement gap, each one making a small contribution to it. And then I began to realize that it's one thing if a child has asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity. Something else, what happens if you have a school where every child has one or more of these challenges? How can such a school ever be expected to have the same average achievement as a school where children come healthy and well-rested, well-nourished, from economically secure homes? You can't have that expectation, no matter how many laws you pass and how often you test the children. Well, we call schools where we concentrate children with those disadvantages, we call them segregated schools. And schools are more segregated today than they have been at any time in the last 45 to 50 years. More segregated. And the reason they're more segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I began to think that maybe neighborhood segregation was a school problem, an educational policy issue, something I ought to be looking into. That's how I began this research, thinking really about educational achievement, not about housing. And then in 2007, I read a Supreme Court decision that involved 2 cities, one of which was Louisville, Kentucky. Louisville had a very, very token, small school desegregation plan. It gave parents the choice, of which school in the district their child would attend. But if the parents' choice was going to exacerbate racial segregation, that choice would not be favored in honor of the choice of a child who would not do so. So if you had an all-white or mostly white school, both a black and a white child applied for one of the last remaining places in that school, the black child would be given some preference to help to desegregate the school. This was a trivial program. You don't have schools with 1 or 2 places left and both a black and a white child apply for the last remaining place. But the Supreme Court evaluated it, denounced it, said you couldn't do such a thing. It was unconstitutional, they said, to have such a program. The opinion was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. The Chief Justice explained that it's true, he said, the schools in Louisville are segregated, but he said the reason they're segregated is because the neighborhoods they're located in are segregated, and the neighborhoods are segregated, in which they're located, are segregated because of de facto circumstances, he said. Well, things I described before, private bigotry, businesses in the private economy, people wanting to live with each other, the same race, economic differences. And the Chief Justice said, we have de facto segregation, something that just happened in fact, not by government policy. It is against the Constitution, a violation for the government to take explicit action to redress it. Well, I read this decision and remembered reading something that happened in Louisville, Kentucky some years before. In Louisville, Kentucky, one of the districts that was the subject of this Supreme Court decision, In Louisville, there was a suburb called Shively where a white homeowner in a single family home in this all white suburb had an African-American friend living in urban Louisville. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran, had a wife and a child, wanted to move to a single family home, but nobody would sell him one. So the white homeowner in this suburb of single family, all white homes, bought a second home for his African-American friend and sold it to him. And when the African-American family moved in, an angry mob of white residents surrounded the home, protected by the police. They threw rocks through the windows. The police made no effort to stop this. They dynamited and firebombed the home. Police made no effort to stop that. But when the riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed with a 15-year sentence the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to a black family. I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police, the criminal justice system, the prosecutors, the courts are all engaged in a conspiracy to make sure that blacks and whites in the Louisville area can't live near one another. It's a civil rights violation, a 14th Amendment violation. These are all state actors. And I began to look into it further, and I found there were hundreds of cases, and I'm not exaggerating, hundreds of cases nationwide, in your area, in the Bay Area, in everywhere, of police protected, sometimes police organized and led, mob violence designed to drive African Americans out of homes that they had legitimately purchased or rented in previously all white neighborhoods. As I say, this took place in the Bay Area. It was in Los Angeles and Denver and Chicago and Detroit and New York, Washington, Baltimore, you can name it. They were examples of state-sponsored, state-protected violence designed to ensure that we maintain a segregated society. Every one of these was a civil rights violation, a violation of the 14th Amendment, something that we as Americans have an obligation to remedy, but we've never accepted and undertaken to fulfill that obligation. I then began to look into it further, and I found there were many, many examples of state, federal, and local policies, racially explicit policies, all of which were designed to ensure that African Americans and whites could not live near one another in any metropolitan area. Every one of them was a constitutional violation. Every one of them belies the myth of de facto segregation. De facto segregation, it turns out, is an utter myth. We have an unconstitutional system of residential boundaries that's as unconstitutional as the segregation of buses and lunch counters and schools and colleges that we addressed in the 20th century. Let me spend a few minutes that I have this morning with you to describe perhaps one of the more powerful policies that the federal government followed to create this segregation. In the immediate post-World War II period, the federal government began a program to move the entire white middle class and working class population out of urban areas into single family homes in all white suburbs. This was a program that was designed to move white families into suburbs out of urban areas, but not black ones. Black ones were prohibited from participating in this program. We were a country at that time that had many, many integrated neighborhoods, broadly integrated. I'm not suggesting every house was a different race, every other house, but broadly integrated neighborhoods because particularly in the East, we were a manufacturing economy. We were making things. Factories had to be located near deep water ports and railroad terminals to get their parts to ship their final products. And so if you had a factory district, which was employing both black and white workers, they all had to live in broadly the same areas in order to be able to walk to work or maybe take short streetcar rides. The same thing was true of the middle-class workers at banks that were servicing these factories. These were broadly integrated neighborhoods. The federal government, the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration in the post-World War II period designed to move the white families out of these neighborhoods into single-family homes in the suburbs. We had millions of returning war veterans at that time. White returning war veterans were particularly targeted by the federal government for this program. Black returning war veterans prohibited from participating in it. The suburbs that were created in this way all across the country, you know them, they're all well known. Perhaps in the East Coast, the most famous is Levittown. In the South Bay, there were suburbs like this. Westlake and Daly City was one of them. In the East Bay, San Lorenzo or San Leandro. These were all white communities financed by the federal government on a racial basis. The developers of these programs, suburban developments, could never have assembled the capital on their own to build the projects. Levittown, east of New York City, was 17,000 homes in one place. Westlake and Daly City, about the same size. No bank would be crazy enough to lend William Levitt in Levittown or Henry Dolger in Westlake the money to build these projects. The banks thought this was a crazy idea. We weren't a suburban country at that time. They didn't think anybody would want to move into these homes from urban areas. The only way that Levitt or Dolger or David Bohannon, the builder of those segregated projects in the East Bay, the only way that they could develop the capital to buy the land and build these homes was to go to the Federal Housing Administration and Veterans Administration, submit their plans for the development, the construction materials they were going to use, the architectural design of the homes, the layout of the streets, and an FHA and VA required commitment that they never sell a home to an African American. The FHA even required these developers to place a clause in the deed of every home prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans. This was a federal requirement. If any of you live in homes that were constructed in this post-war period, as well as some who may have been constructed before then, look at your deeds, or in California at your CC&Rs. You'll see that you're living in a home for Caucasians only. This was not the action of rogue bureaucrats at the FHA or VA. This was written federal policy that was distributed to appraisers all over the country, whose job it was to evaluate the applications of builders to build these suburban developments. The underwriting manual that it distributed to appraisers said that you couldn't recommend for a federal bank guarantee a loan to a developer who was going to sell to African Americans in a white development. You couldn't even recommend for a federal bank guarantee an all-white project if it was going to be located near where African Americans were living. Because in the words of the manual, and I'm quoting, this would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal policy manual said. This notion of de facto segregation, as I say, is utter nonsense. There's no basis in historical reality to it whatsoever. The homes in places like Westlake and in Levittown and everywhere in between were inexpensive. They sold at the time for about $8,000 a piece. In today's money, that's about $100,000. White returning war veterans, white working class, middle class families could buy those homes for $100,000 in today's money. Anybody with a job in the post-war economy with a guaranteed loan, an FHA loan, a mortgage loan, or a VA loan could afford to buy such a home with a 20-year amortized mortgage at the time. If you're a returning war veteran and white, you could pay less in your monthly housing costs by buying one of these suburban homes that the federal government was subsidizing than you had been paying for rent even in public housing prior to moving into these suburbs. Well, the white families who bought these homes over the next couple of generations gained wealth as the homes appreciated in value. They went from $100,000 at the time to $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 in most parts of the country, in the parts of the Bay Area, $1 million or more. The white families gained equity as their homes appreciated in value, wealth. They used that wealth to send their children to college. They used it to perhaps take care of temporary emergencies, maybe short-term unemployment, maybe a medical emergency. They used it to subsidize their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans were prohibited by explicit written federal policy from participating in this wealth generating program. The result is that today, African American incomes on average are about 60%, 60% of white incomes, family incomes. You would think that if you have a 60% income ratio, you'd have a 60% wealth ratio as well. People can save the same amount of money from the same incomes. But in reality, although white family incomes, or rather black family incomes, are 60% of white family incomes, African-American household wealth is now 5% of white household wealth. And that enormous disparity between a 60% income ratio and a 5% wealth ratio is entirely attributable to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century, that we have never remedied, that we've never accepted an obligation to remedy, as the Constitution requires us as Americans to do. That wealth gap, along with other forms of state-sponsored discrimination, determines the racial inequality we have today. The story I'm telling you is not somehow an historical accident or curiosity. It determines the racial inequality we have today. I described earlier how the fact that African Americans are locked into less well-resourced neighborhoods, they don't have the wealth to be able to make down payments on homes in more highly resourced neighborhoods, is a contributor to the achievement gap in schools. It's a contributor to health disparities between African Americans and whites. African Americans have shorter life expectancies on average, greater rates of cardiovascular disease because they live in more polluted neighborhoods. It contributes to the mass incarceration of young Black men and as Hispanic young men, as well as police abuse that we spent so much time demonstrating about last spring and summer. I'm not suggesting that no police officers would ever abuse young Black men. Clearly some would, but it's much, much more intense because we segregate and concentrate the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods where they have no access to good jobs, no access to the transportation to get to those good jobs, no access to schools where they can get educations that are not overwhelmed by the social and economic problems of their fellow students. That's a consequence of the wealth gap that we, all of us, our government on our behalf, created. Police forces in segregated Black neighborhoods assume habits of policing that are designed to keep the neighborhood under control, to prevent its problems from leaking out into the broader community. The tactics that police use in those communities are similar to those that are used by occupying forces in colonial countries in the 20th century, the British in India, the Belgians in the Congo. This is what the situation that we've created by instituting this legal segregation, or legal in the sense of created by government. And the segregation that this wealth gap reinforces and sustains is responsible for something else that's very, very frightening and dangerous. And that is the enormous political polarization that we have in this country today, that I find very frightening and dangerous. Perhaps you do as well. It's largely racial. It's not entirely so, but it largely tracks racial lines. How can we ever expect to develop the common national identity that we need to preserve this democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that they have no ability to understand each other, no ability to empathize with each other? That's the consequence of this segregation that we have created. Let me give you a couple of Bay Area examples that illustrate the way in which government, in the policy I just described and in others as well, created the segregation that we know today. As you may know, the African-American population of California and other West Coast states was pretty small prior to World War II. The large migration of African-Americans into the West Coast took place during World War II to take jobs in war plants, shipyards in particular, airplane factories that hadn't existed prior to World War II. Both white and black workers flocked to the West Coast to take these jobs that hadn't been available during the Depression. The government had to find housing for them. If it wanted the ships and the planes to be produced, it had to find housing for them, and it did, always on a segregated basis. I said there are very few African Americans living here before, so it wasn't that there wasn't a firm segregated pattern that the government followed. It simply created it. In San Francisco, the government created 5 projects for war workers in shipyards in the San Francisco Bay Area. 4 were for whites only. 1 was for African Americans, placed in the Fillmore District. And the Fillmore District then became the black neighborhood of San Francisco as a result of that initial placement of a housing for war workers. On the East Bay, the federal government needed to find housing for shipyard workers in the Richmond shipyards, the Kaiser shipyards, an enormous facility, 5 shipyards there. The government did find housing. It built separate housing for workers working in the same shipyards. For the white workers in Berkeley and Albany, just north of Berkeley, the government built housing along the shopping area and the residential area of Berkeley and Albany. And for the black workers, built separate housing in the industrial area along the railroad tracks, creating segregation where it hadn't previously existed. This was done all up and down the West Coast. It's how Washington and Seattle and Portland and Los Angeles were also segregated by this action of the federal government. And all across the country, the federal government built segregated housing for war workers who are frequently working in the same war plants. I'll give you another example, if I may, of coming closer to your homes in the Silicon Valley. The great the great white novelist Wallace Stegner wrote an autobiography prior to World War II that got him some notoriety. So Stanford University recruited him to teach writing at the end of World War II, and he came to Stanford, to Palo Alto, looking for housing at that time. Couldn't find any. There was a housing shortage, so he joined a cooperative that was made up of other middle-class, working-class families. College professors in those days weren't paid the exorbitant salaries that Stanford pays them today. So he had an income that was similar to construction workers and mail carriers and school teachers. He organized and helped to organize and joined a cooperative that bought a large tract of land outside of Stanford University, intending to build 400 homes on that tract for its members. The cooperative applied for a bank loan to do the construction of the homes with the land that it had bought. The bank refused to give them the loan because the Federal Housing Administration wouldn't approve it. Because that cooperative of 100 members, three families who were members of the cooperative were African American. And unless those African American members were expelled, the Federal Housing Administration wouldn't guarantee that bank loan. The cooperative debated what to do. They tried to compromise with the Federal Housing Administration. At one point, the cooperative proposed that it would ensure that the share of housing occupied by African Americans in its project wouldn't exceed the share of African Americans in the state of California. Federal Housing Administration refused that compromise. Eventually, the cooperative, Wallace Stegner and his comrades were forced to disband the cooperative, sell the land to a private developer who built a development called Ladera, still there today, for whites only, with restrictive covenants in the deeds and the FHA guaranteed loans for a whites only project. Well, the policies to redress segregation are well known. No mystery about them. We know what to do. The federal government, for example, should be buying up homes in places like Levittown, like Ladera, at market rates, anywhere from $300,000 to $400,000, probably in Ladera closer to $1 million. It should be buying up those homes and reselling them at deeply discounted prices to African Americans. that would be a narrowly targeted remedy to a very specific constitutional violation. And there's no political support for it, but that would be a constitutional remedy. We also have programs that subsidize low-income families, disproportionately African-American and Hispanic. They reinforce segregation today. The low-income housing tax credit is the biggest one. It's a subsidy to low-income families, rather to developers who would build housing for low-income families. The Treasury Department that administers this program places a priority on placing low-income housing units in existing low-income neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. It's crazy. We should be doing the opposite. We should be requiring that more of those units be placed in high opportunity communities, in the communities where you live. It's not that we shouldn't be placing better housing in low-income neighborhoods. Of course we should. Every neighborhood should have better housing. But we shouldn't be perpetuating and reinforcing segregation by placing more of them in the lowest income communities. We don't do it for a number of reasons. One is that many of the communities where you live have zoning ordinances that prohibit the construction of not just low-income housing, prohibits the construction of workforce housing, of housing for middle-class families who can't afford to buy or rent homes in your housing market. We should be supporting that housing by modifying the zoning ordinances that prohibit, as I say, townhouses or garden apartments or condominiums even, or apartment buildings that blend in with the residential community. We don't do that because there's no political support. The policies, I say, to redress segregation are well known. We don't do them because we don't have the kind of civil rights movement that we had in the 1960s that's going to make it uncomfortable not to redress the segregation that we've created. We have many organizations like yours that are doing good work and advocating for those policies, but we need more. We need a political movement. We need political support that's going to create a different political environment so that you can be more successful. I'm involved with a group of national civil rights leaders that is trying to create something we call a new movement to redress racial segregation, whose role it will be to organize local civil rights groups that will develop political momentum and take direct action to enforce policies of desegregation, of redress of segregation that we haven't been able to attempt so far. Just a few months ago, I published an article in the New York Times in which I took a neighborhood of San Mateo, although I could have done this anywhere in the country, but I took a neighborhood of San Mateo that had been created in the 1940s by a developer working with a real estate agency and a bank on a segregated white basis. African Americans were prohibited from buying there at a time when even in San Mateo, in this neighborhood, the homes cost only $100,000 in today's money. In this article, I identified the bank, the realtor, the developer who created this community on a segregated basis. And I suggested that a new civil rights movement should be engaged in the campaign to get that developer, that bank, that realtor, whose successors still exist today in that community, to embark on a program of deeply subsidizing the movement of homes of African Americans into homes from which those institutions themselves had worked with the federal government to help to segregate. I can make available to you, if you wish, a copy of that article, as well as a way in which you can get more information about the new movement to redress racial segregation as it organizes in your community. With that, I think my time is up, and I want to thank you for your attention and look forward to engaging in a discussion with you.
Thank you so much for that overview. It's a really tremendous book, and I think there are plenty more anecdotes and stories in that book for those who are interested, including the actions that the Santa Clara County Board of Supervisors took. So with that, we'll move into the Q&A portion of today's event. And I'll start with just a general broad question that we're getting a lot is, what can we do? What can we do? I know you discussed a little bit towards the end of the presentation. One of the things that I found interesting in your book was a discussion of local school boards and how that could be an effective way to promote change. So any thoughts there?
Sure. And as I say, I don't know if you do circulate the information later to attendees at this session, but I can make some of this available to you. For example, as I wrote this book, I examined the textbooks that are commonly used in American history classes all over the country, high school classes. I found that every one of them lies about it. They talk about the great work that the New Deal did in creating housing, never mentioning it was always done on a segregated basis, as in the example of the Bay Area that I talked about. The textbooks talk about how the Federal Housing Administration created suburbs, never mentioning it was for whites only, promoting the myth of de facto segregation. Well, the new movement to redress racial segregation that I mentioned and I'm affiliated with has a curriculum unit that teaches the history accurately. And one of the things that local civil rights activist groups could do, not just the ones that we help organize, but any of you can do it. You don't need a big organization to do this, is to examine your the way in which this history is taught in your schools. If necessary, take steps to get your superintendent and your school board members, your principals, to adopt an alternative curriculum that teaches this history accurately. The curriculum that we're promoting and make available is free. You can take it to your schools and insist that they use it or something similar, because if the next generation doesn't learn this history any better than we have, they're going to be in as poor a position to remedy it as we've been. So I think that's probably what you were referring to. And as I say, I'd be glad to make this curriculum unit available to you, and you can take it. It's for free, and you can take it and see if you can get it adopted to teach this history accurately.
One of the questions I have here is, are there any existing laws or regulations still on the books today that should be struck down to create more equitable access to housing?
Well, I mentioned one. I don't know if it needs to be struck down, but it certainly needs to be modified. That is the low-income housing tax credit, the program of the Treasury Department that provides tax credits to developers to build housing for low-income families. And that program should be revised so that it places a priority in placing more of those low-income units in higher opportunity communities where families have better access to resources. As I mentioned, you're talking about something that needs to be struck down. In my judgment, zoning ordinances that require nothing but single-family homes, sometimes even on large lot sizes in communities or in large parts of those communities, should be struck down. They reinforce an unconstitutionally created segregation and in themselves, therefore, I think are subject to challenge. But in most cases, what we have is not laws that continue to perpetuate segregation explicitly, but laws that have a discriminatory effect. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Even though they don't mention race explicitly. There's been a lot of attention recently, and I'm now writing about it. Well, I have written about it, and I can send you this as well if you'd like, about the fact that throughout the country, and I mean throughout the country, not just in an isolated community here or there, African Americans who own homes are paying property taxes at a higher rate relative to the market value of their homes than white families are paying relative to the market value of their homes. African Americans are bearing a disproportionate share of the costs of schools, libraries, fire departments, other things supported by property taxes. That's a result of a discriminatory in-effect assessment system, and there are a number of reasons why this happens. One is, for example, that if assessments aren't done and this doesn't apply, by the way, to California, because we have a Prop 13 that uniquely in this country doesn't affect this, but it's still an example of what can be done nationwide. This is not just a California problem. If assessments aren't done regularly, white homes are going to appreciate in value faster than black homes. So the assessed values in black neighborhoods will be closer to their true market value than the assessed values in white neighborhoods, leading African Americans to pay a disproportionately high share of property taxes. There are many, many of these policies and laws that reinforce segregation, the discriminatory in effect, even though they are not discriminatory in explicit intent. And there are some laws that we need that fill in gaps in existing laws that are discriminatory in other ways. I mentioned before the low-income housing tax credit. We have federal subsidies for low-income families with that low-income housing tax credit. We have federal subsidies for renters with the Section 8 voucher program that subsidizes their rent. Both of those reinforce segregation. It's not just the low-income housing tax credit. The Section 8 program also disproportionately places tenants in existing low-income segregated neighborhoods because the vouchers aren't high enough in value to afford rentals in higher opportunity places. But we have no subsidies whatsoever for workforce, for middle-income families that are also in desperate need of housing, and African-American middle-class families, working-class families are also segregated, not in the lowest income neighborhoods, but in predominantly or heavily African-American neighborhoods, which have fewer resources than the neighborhoods where white middle-class and working-class families with similar incomes live. We don't have a federal program that subsidizes the housing for workforce families. That needs to be done at a local level. I know that there are some places in your area in the Silicon Valley that are working on local subsidies for workforce housing. We need to have a racial lens on those to make sure that we're not simply subsidizing only white families and middle-class and workforce families. I know there's a local group that you may be familiar with, Manzanita Works, that's trying to increase the amount of workforce housing with local subsidies in your community. You might look into it and see if it's something you might support. But this is a big gap in our national housing policies that can only be addressed locally because, as I say, middle-class and working-class African Americans are segregated as well, even though not as severely as the lowest income families, but there's no federal support for their housing whatsoever.
You know, sort of to dovetail that on for that, and I'm getting a ton of questions coming in. As you know, SB 287, SB 50, which addressed inclusionary housing, did not make it through the California legislature. And now you have a lot of local municipalities looking at inclusionary zoning. Some are trying to decide whether it should be near transit corridors, transit hubs, or could perhaps be throughout cities, even not near transit hubs. But one of the questions I had was, do you think it would be possible to overturn single family zoning as a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment?
Well, you know, as I say, I'm convinced that we cannot solve this with litigation. We can't even solve it with legislation, which has no chance of being passed. We don't have the political support at this point to do what you're talking about. In theory, I think yes. I think those zoning ordinances do violate the 14th Amendment as well as the Fair Housing Act. But the courts follow public opinion in this area, and they're not likely to enact, to issue those kinds of rulings without a civil rights movement that's creating a different environment. That's why my emphasis is primarily on how do we organize that civil rights movement, because unless it creates a different political environment, we're not going to get legal victories or even legislation that's going to do much to fix this problem.
Let's see, I have another question here. Do you have any examples of how your work is being applied to fighting school segregation?
Well, I don't think you need to credit my work. There have been many people and groups that have been working on school desegregation for decades. Didn't start with my book at all. Fundamentally, of course, and I think this is the message I've been giving you, we're not going to be able to desegregate schools unless we desegregate the neighborhoods in which they're located. There's a little bit we can do. Obviously, in smaller communities where Black and white neighborhoods aren't so far from each other, that you can adjust attendance boundaries and create magnet schools and do other things that will enable children to attend school that might be a little bit farther from their home, but not a lot farther from their home in a more desegregated environment. But for the most part, most African-American children in this country live too far away from highly resourced white neighborhoods. Most white children live too far away from African Americans for any substantial school desegregation to occur, so long as the segregated living patterns exist. There is a group of people, workers, it's called the National Association of, well, it's part, I forget the exact name, it's part of the Poverty and Race Research Action Council, PRRAC.org. And if you go to that website, you'll find the group that is promoting the kinds of policies I've been describing, magnet schools, attendance zone boundary changes, short distance busing to create the kind of desegregation that we need. But they're able to affect a very small part of the segregated school population because it's driven by residential segregation.
One of the questions that I received, and something that I've heard before, is that as we make strides in, say, affordable housing, sometimes, you know, they're retracted a bit. For instance, in the recession subprime mortgage collapse, as we know, that collapse disproportionately affected people of color. How can we approach addressing this very recent wrong and prevent future predatory loans targeting people of color, if you have an idea there?
Well, we need much more rigorous enforcement of the Fair Housing Act that would have prohibited the kind of targeting of African American and Hispanic homeowners for exploitative subprime loans and the lending that led up to the 2008 housing bubble collapse. But we don't have adequate enforcement of the Fair Housing Act today. We have virtually no enforcement at all. There was an expose by investigative reporters in New York. Newsday is a newspaper on Long Island. They fitted cameras, buttonhole cameras, with paired testers. That is, New York has a lot of unemployed actors, and they were able to hire a lot of unemployed actors to test realtors. They had black and white testers, that is, people posing as home buyers with identical financial records, identical employment histories, identical wealth savings, and they demonstrated how differently the white and the black home seekers were treated. This expose showed the extent of discrimination in the practices of realtors. Similar testing has been done in New York against banks on lending, the issue that you had just referred to. But it's not being done anywhere, and the federal government isn't doing it to any extent. It's expensive to do. And in a place like California, actually, you would be prohibited by law from doing it because you need two-way consent to conduct a conversation. And so a tester couldn't go and record a conversation with a realtor to demonstrate the extent to which white and black home seekers, or with a banker to demonstrate the extent to which mortgage applicants, black and white, were being treated differently. So we need much, much more vigorous enforcement of the Fair Housing Act. And in the 11 states that require two-way consent, we need an exception to that two-way consent law that permits fair housing testing to take place.
One of the questions I had, and I think this is important for a lot of folks on this call, has to do with gentrification and displacement. My lighting might not be right today because I'm actually in the garage of my sister's house up near Sacramento, because she was priced out of Santa Clara County. In fact, yesterday I visited another friend in Reno. What are your thoughts on the kinds of approaches we can take to address gentrification and displacement, especially in communities of color?
Well, again, I'm sorry to repeat myself, the policies are well known. We know how to control gentrification, how to control massive displacement of existing residents who are disproportionately African American and Hispanic from gentrifying neighborhoods. The policies include, hello? Are you there still? Are you there?
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay, all right. Did you hear me? Were you able to hear me?
I think I may have paused for just a minute. I'm sorry about that, but we're good now.
All right. Well, I'd say the policies to prevent massive dislocation of African American and Hispanic homeowners are well known. What's missing is the political support to enact them. We need rigorous rent control, much more rigorous than we have permitted in California. Limits on condominium conversions, inclusionary zoning, and I keep on emphasizing to you that inclusionary zoning has to include not just what's typically called affordable housing for the lowest income families, but housing for moderate income families who are also being priced out of gentrifying neighborhoods. We need zoning rules that require a share of units be set aside for families like that. So the reason we don't implement those policies is not because we don't know what to do. The reason we don't implement them is because we don't have the political support to do so. And that's why my focus is not on thinking about new policy ideas. We've got them. It's trying to figure out how we can get the political support to implement them.
I think you're exactly right there. If I'm not mistaken, my friends at Silicon Valley at Home mentioned that the polling shows that folks of all neighborhoods within the Silicon Valley want their kids to be able to continue to live there and want to grow up near their grandkids, but still, the political support may or may not be there. So I think you're right.
Yes, but let me say that it's not only their kids who need to grow up in those neighborhoods, but it's other people's kids who also need the opportunity to grow up in these highly resourced neighborhoods. And simply creating opportunities, which is necessary, it's essential for moderate and middle income and workforce families to live in communities from which they're now priced out, will not in itself address the segregation that those communities persist in having. We need racially conscious policies in addition to better housing subsidy policies in order to redress segregation. Both are necessary. We can't do one and not the other and expect to solve the unconstitutional segregation that we've created.
Yeah, I do think I appreciate how you approach it from so many different angles, that not one solution will solve everything, right? Let's see. Oh, do you have any recommendations for the Biden administration? What actions could realistically be taken?
Well, I know I'm sounding like a broken record. The Biden administration has some great ideas. None of them are politically feasible in this area. The Biden administration supports the abolition of exclusionary zoning. The Biden administration supports greater enforcement of the Fair Housing Act. The Biden administration even supports a stronger, what's called a disparate impact rule that would enable policies that are not racially explicit, but that are discriminatory in effect, like that one I described before, to be challenged under the Fair Housing Act. Let me take a minute, Carlos, and say that in 1968, I'm going to go back in history a bit. In 1968, Richard Nixon was elected president. I guess most of you were born after that time, but or many of you were. But Richard Nixon was elected president, and he appointed as his first Secretary of Housing and Urban Development a fellow by the name of George Romney, the former governor of Michigan and the father of a present U.S. senator that you may have heard of. Romney is the first HUD secretary, acknowledged the history I've described to you. You know, the subtitle of my book is A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America. It wasn't hidden, it was well known. Romney, the Secretary of HUD, talked about it all the time. He talked about how the federal government has created a white noose around Black neighborhoods. Romney embarked on a program which he called the Open Communities Program. It required suburbs to take steps to desegregate, required them to change their zoning laws, required them to accept affordable housing, required them to accept public housing. And the program provided that federal funds would be held from suburbs that didn't desegregate in these ways. Romney actually withheld federal funds, something inconceivable today, from 3 white suburbs that persisted in maintaining its segregated patterns. One was Baltimore County. It surrounds Baltimore City. Another was Warren, Michigan. The third was an area outside Cleveland. There was a backlash, a political backlash from the residents of those communities and others that feared the same thing that would happen, the white residents. Eventually, Nixon forced Romney out as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. The Open Communities Program was disbanded. Those communities continued to maintain their segregated patterns, and we've had nothing so effective since, or so ambitious since. The Biden administration has ambitions much like the ambitions that George Romney had in 1969 to desegregate suburban areas. But I don't think the political support for those programs are any stronger now than they were in 1969. And so I think that our focus needs to be, how do we build that political support, not how do we come up with more policy ideas. And I'm very hopeful that we can. You know, we're having a more accurate and passionate discussion today in this country about race, the legacies of slavery and Jim Crow, than we ever have had before in American history, ever before in American history. We had 20 million Americans participating in Black Lives Matter demonstrations last summer and spring. Unheard of. Those demonstrations were led by African Americans, but the majority of participants were white. In places like Silicon Valley and elsewhere in the Bay Area. Those demonstrations reflect a growing awareness of racial inequality. We need now to move beyond demonstrations, one-off demonstrations, and see how those people who are engaged in this protest, in this reflection of their concern about racial inequality, see how they can be organized into a new civil rights movement that's going to go beyond demonstrations and actually have plans developed to tackle specific areas of segregation and redress them.
Yeah, you know, I know for a fact there are a number of people on this call that were right out there with me in downtown San Jose during last summer.
Mm-hmm.
So I think they're all, you know, how do we keep that momentum going? You know,
Right.
Let's see, another question I have. So this question is, are there municipalities that are undertaking a project of cataloging their past policies or actions to try and make amends or at least reflect on that?
Well, those are two separate things. There are, as I said, we're having a more accurate and passionate discussion about race than ever before. There are many communities that are cataloging their past actions. I don't know if communities are taking strong steps to redress them. The cataloging is the first step, but it needs to move beyond that to action. And the actions turn out to be much more modest than the solutions that are necessary to redress the actions that they are cataloging. So I don't know of any communities, for example, that are deeply subsidizing the movements of African Americans into neighborhoods that they were excluded from, and that are now unaffordable, but that would have been affordable at the time. There are communities, let me say, that are taking a small step. They're providing modest down payment assistance to first-time home buyers to help them access homes, but that doesn't, as you well know as well as I do, that just doesn't get them into the neighborhoods from which they were excluded, these modest down payment programs. So we need something much deeper, much more aggressive if we're going to take seriously the redress of the policies that we're cataloging. There's a lot of attention these days to restrictive covenants, that is these deed clauses that say that a home is can be occupied or owned only by a Caucasian. A lot of attention to that. People want to know how they can remove those covenants from their deeds. I approve of that attention, but naming it doesn't fix it, doesn't change it. And I don't know of any strong movements in this country that are taking real efforts to redress their segregation.
I have a question that I know you touched on briefly in your book, but where was the labor movement during this time? It seems, I think a lot of people have forgotten the history of the AFL versus the CIO. Can you touch on that maybe for a moment?
Well, sure. I did devote some pages in the book, as you say, to labor market issues, because income inequality, that 60% income ratio that I talked about, also contributes to residential segregation, because it's not only down payments that African Americans require, but also the ability to pay make higher payments for expensive homes in neighborhoods from which they were once excluded. So there are many labor market policies that we followed in this country that were equally unconstitutional as the housing policies I described, that created and contributed to that income gap. One of them was, as you may know, and this may be what you were referring to, in 1934, I think it was, the National Labor Relations Act was introduced in Congress. This is a law that requires the government to certify as the exclusive bargaining agent of workers with their employer particular unions. When the bill was introduced, it included a provision that said the federal government would be prohibited from certifying a union to have exclusive collective bargaining rights, that is, the right to negotiate a contract covering an employer's employees, that it would be unlawful for the government to certify a union that excluded African Americans from membership. That provision was then removed in congressional debate. And so when the National Labor Relations Act was passed, it authorized the government to certify unions that excluded African Americans from membership. And the National Labor Relations Board, which administers the National Labor Relations Act, didn't begin refusing certification to unions that excluded African Americans until the mid-1960s. And it only began then. It didn't, it continued into the 1970s, this beginning. Well, the result was that African Americans were not able to participate in the post-war housing boom, the construction of it. Not just they couldn't own homes in the suburbs that were being created, they couldn't have the good jobs that were involved in building these suburbs, and their incomes therefore were not as great as those of whites with comparable skills and desires to have employment. That's one way in which unconstitutional policy created this income gap. When the Social Security Act was passed for the first time, when we first got Social Security in the late 1930s, It excluded from coverage occupations in which African Americans predominated. Agricultural workers, for example, there's no reason why they should have been excluded from Social Security. Domestic workers, they were excluded only because these were African American occupations disproportionately. So those are some examples of what you're talking about. The same thing, by the way, is true of the minimum wage law. The minimum wage law excluded occupations in which African Americans predominated.
I found that part to be really interesting portion of the book. Let me see. We have about 5 minutes left. One of the questions I got was, can you recommend some resources or places someone should start looking if they want to research their history in their own city?
Well, it varies from city to city. When we launch this new movement to redress racial segregation, we'll have a research staff that will help you do it in your city. What, for example, I did in that San Mateo community. That research I did in San Mateo required going back into deeds of homes that were sold in the 1940s, identifying the bank that was a party to the deed and to the CC&R that excluded anybody but Caucasians from living there. But the research will vary from place to place. So I can't, a good place to go, of course, we can't do this in COVID unless your local library has digitized all of its neighborhood newspapers going back into the 1930s and 40s. But once we open up again, you can go to libraries. Many libraries have collections of old community newspapers. And those are places that look at the real estate display ads to see the display ads that advertise exclusive community or something to that effect. It varies from place to place, as I say, and we will have a research staff that could support you, but we haven't launched this yet.
Great. I think another place I might mention is the University of Richmond has a pretty strong collection of different maps created in the 1930s by FHA. I know I was able to find my grandparents who were from a city called Youngstown, Ohio, and yeah, right in the red zone, you can find their houses. Same thing with Cleveland.
Right. Yeah.
Let's see. We have another question. I think one of the last questions we have is how do you, and this is kind of one that I've been nibbling on too, is how do you, a lot of these solutions that you've sort of recommended just don't, at first blush, don't seem constitutional on their face. I mean, the court has trended away from disparate impact as being something that they want to take into consideration with cases like Carter and Ricci, et cetera. So how do you implement some of the solutions that you've mentioned without running afoul of the Equal Protection Clause and doing things based on race?
Well, they are, the things I'm talking about, the remedies are constitutional. The fact that the court misunderstands the Constitution doesn't make these policies unconstitutional. A bit of history would do us some good, of history understanding. There's only been a 15-year period in this country's history when the Supreme Court has taken a legitimately constitutional view of race relations. In every other period of this country, except for 1954 to 1969, the period of the Warren Court, the Supreme Court has upheld slavery. It's upheld Jim Crow, segregation. I've been reading recently a book about the Dred Scott decision. As you may know, some of you know history, the Dred Scott decision in 1857 was a decision of the Supreme Court that said you couldn't even have free blacks in northern states. It was unconstitutional to permit African Americans to be free. That's what the Supreme Court said. And in response to that, Abraham Lincoln and other advocates of the end of slavery defied the Supreme Court. They said not only the Supreme Court was wrong, New York State responded to that Supreme Court decision by passing a law making slaveholding a felony, going right in the face of the Supreme Court. Well, and then, of course, you all know that up until 1954, the Supreme Court said that it was constitutional to have segregation until the Brown versus Board of Education decision. So I don't think that we should, of course, we have a problem with the Supreme Court, but to think that the Supreme Court is the arbiter of what's constitutional is I think, a big error. We need to adopt and enact policies that defy the Supreme Court, let them enforce it, let them prohibit us from remedying the unconstitutional policies that the government has faced. And if enough people begin to do this, as in the past, we'll get different Supreme Court decisions.
Yeah, I think Charles Houston, who was the Dean of Howard and Thurgood Marshall's teacher, I think he called Dred Scott a dragon that needed to be slayed or something along those lines, if I'm not mistaken.
But so let me just say, the Dred Scott decision was based on a misreading of history. The Dred Scott decision, the majority opinion said that the reason that African Americans couldn't be citizens anywhere, not just in the slaveholding states, was because they weren't citizens at the time the Constitution was adopted. So the Constitution didn't anticipate having African Americans as citizens. And what the dissent in that opinion showed was that was just wrong history. African Americans were citizens in northern states. They voted in the elections that ratified the Constitution. Likewise, the decision that I described earlier, the 2007 decision of the Supreme Court that based its prohibition on desegregating schools on a flawed mythical history that government had nothing to do with creating segregation. That 2007 decision stands right in the tradition of Dred Scott, of using a distorted, false, demonstrably false history to justify a constitutional theory that continues the subjugation and segregation of African Americans. So I think it's a big mistake to say that policies to redress segregation are unconstitutional. The Supreme Court may consider them so, but it's wrong. They are perfectly constitutional, and they need to be implemented, and we need to fight the Supreme Court in implementing these policies, not be intimidated by it any more than the New York State Legislature was intimidated by the Dred Scott decision.
That's a great example. All right, let's see this. Let's see. Our time here is coming to a close. So I really just wanted to take one last opportunity to thank you, Richard Rothstein, for the presentation and thoughtful insights, as well as the audience for all the timely questions. I also wanted to thank the Housing Leadership Council for co-hosting today's event. Now, if all attendees could do a quick favor, we're going to run a quick poll to get your feedback on today's event with a few simple questions now.
And may I say something? I don't know if you do this, Carlos, but if you want to send out an email to registrants with some of the links that I've described, I can give those to you.
That would be perfect. All right. Also, I'd like to let everybody know, I think this was mentioned in the chat, but if you'd like a copy of the book, The Color of Law, please use the link in the chat, and SB at Home will send the first 100 participants a complimentary copy. Also, before I go, I want to invite everybody. There's a special follow-up discussion on today's event. So next Friday, or I guess 2 Fridays from now, May 28th, SB at Home and the Housing Leadership Council will host a discussion to reflect on today's presentation and talk more about what actions we can take in our community to address the legacy of discriminatory housing practices. You can RSVP to that event and other Affordable Housing Month events on SB at Home's website, which should also be in the chat for you to click on. Before we go, I want to say one last thank you to our sponsors and hear from them why they support affordable housing and why they support Affordable Housing Month. I think somebody may be playing a video.
experiencing homelessness is 25 years less than for people who are stably housed. This statistic is one of the reasons the Health Trust prioritizes health in housing.
Until we fix the housing instability that so many in our communities face, we will not have a community that is sustainable in the future, where we all want to live, one that is hopeful.
I am passionate about advocating for housing because it is critical to both our collective and individual success. We need local housing solutions so we can generate broad-based economic growth, reduce commutes, and generate prosperity for everyone.
For me personally, and for the work we're doing at Urban Catalyst, providing more housing solutions for all levels of income is vital to the success of the community.
Hi, my name is Lenny Gutierrez, and I work for Comcast. We are excited to be sponsors for the first time of SV at Home's Affordable Housing Month. We know how important it is for there to be affordable housing, and just as importantly, how important it is to have affordable broadband at home.
I am hopeful that we can solve housing instability because working at Destination Home, I see the passion and drive of my colleagues and partners every single day. As part of our Housing Ready Communities work, I see clear and abundant desire among neighbors and community members to help, learn, and get involved.
Hi, I'm Patty with Habitat for Humanity, East Bay, Silicon Valley. And yes, I feel hopeful even in the midst of this housing crisis. A community of engaged, impassioned people that are willing to do something about affordable housing can have that kind of impact.
At HealthNet, we believe every person deserves a safety net for their health regardless of age, income, employment status, or current state of health. We understand how important housing is to the health of an individual, especially for one's physical and mental health. And that's why we're excited to be sponsors for this year's SV at Home Affordable Housing Month.
Palo Alto Forward supports expanding the supply of housing that's really affordable to low and moderate income residents. We do that because it helps equity, the environment, and the economy.
Hi, I'm Candice Gonzalez. On behalf of Sandhill Property Company, we are happy to support SV at Home's Affordable Housing Month. We believe that housing should be a right, and we believe in housing for all.
At Applied Materials, we believe that everyone deserves access to safe and affordable housing. But we know that this simply isn't the reality right now in our community. Through activities and engagement like Affordable Housing Month, individuals in our community have the opportunity to dive deeper into the issues that cause the inequities in Silicon Valley, as well as really focus on the solutions.
Facebook's been in the housing space for several years now. In 2019, we made our $1 billion commitment to increase housing affordability and launched our first fund out of that commitment. I want to thank SV at Home for putting on such a stellar lineup again this year. I'm really looking forward to the events and the critical conversations that we need to have about how to increase housing opportunity for all.
All right, thank you, everyone. We invite you to participate in that video collection project and share why affordable housing is important to you. There should be a link being shared in the chat, and we invite you to pick a question, respond to it, share your insights, reactions, and your perspectives. It's as easy as one click, and can be done in your browser after the event. Again, you can find that link in the chat. I just really wanted to personally thank Mr. Rothstein again. I was getting questions from my Facebook, on my text messages, through my emails, throughout the entire event. I think there are a lot of people interested in this. So thank you for sharing your materials, sharing your time with us. I hope folks have a chance to read the book. Any last remarks, Mr. Rothstein?
Well, thank you. To whom should I send these links? Should I send them to you, Carlos? I don't think I have your address.
I think it'd be perfect to send them to the good folks at Silicon Valley at Home.
Melinda.
Okay. Oh, Melinda. Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Well, it's a pleasure being with you. I love doing this because I love talking about this. I could have gone on for 3 years. So thank you very much. And I love that last question about these things being unconstitutional. I've given a lot of these talks. It's the first time I've ever had the opportunity to talk about the Dred Scott decision. So that was great.
Well, it's
Thank
1:30. Everybody have a great day. Stay safe. And that concludes the program.
Thanks.